Hello, welcome to Everything Economics, and today we're going to talk about GDP or Gross Domestic Product. So this presentation is Understanding GDP, the heart of a nation's economy. So let's get started. What is GDP? Well, GDP is a gross domestic product which measures the total value of all goods and services produced in a country over a specific period. So a lot of times when you're listening to the news on the business report, you'll hear about quarterly GDP results, and of course we have the annual GDP. And the GDP shows the size and health of an economy. So if the GDP is going up, it would suggest that the economy is moving along, that businesses and consumers uh, are businesses are producing products, consumers are buying those products, and that the wealth of the nation is increasing. If it goes down, then it suggests that there's like a recession or that growth is slowing down and so forth. And it also is a comparison between nations. You know, one nation may be having a great GDP growth, other nation may be having a slow or even a negative GDP growth. It's not a perfect measurement, but it is very helpful. So let's move on. All right, why GDP matters? Well, first of all, it tracks economic growth, as we just mentioned. You can tell from quarter to quarter or year to year how the economy is doing, what parts of the economy are growing or slowing down. It also helps compare countries. Again, you can compare United States economy with, say, the economy of Japan or China or France or Germany. Um, it also helps guides government policy. In other words, uh, the measurements or the calculations that are used to make up the GDP, uh, we can find out, well, which part of the economy is doing well, which part of the economy is falling behind, because it takes into consideration of imports and exports, investment, government spending, and so forth. And of course, policy analysts can look at this and try to figure out and maybe create policies to help one area or another. It also indicates living standards. So you might have a large GDP relative to other countries, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you have a high living standard, or you may have a low GDP, but maybe the living standard is better relative to other countries. And we'll go into a little bit more detail, but generally speaking, a higher GDP usually implies a greater living standard. Now, types of GDP. There's nominal GDP, which is measured at current prices, which includes inflation. So just a nominal GDP growth every quarter or every year. Then there's real GDP, which is adjusted for inflation. And this shows the true growth. So we have kind of like a base year, and then we look at how GDP has grown, uh, accounting for or adjusted for inflation. Now, we're not going to do any calculations in this lecture, but at least be aware that there's nominal GDP and real GDP. Plus, there's GDP per capita. GDP per capita is simply GDP divided by the population, and this is just average wealth. And I'll show you an example later in the lecture. All right, components of GDP, the expenditure approach. Well, what makes up GDP? Well, it's basically a simple mathematical formula. And we have C, which is consumption, and consumption is your household spending. So if you go out and buy a car, you go out and buy a new TV, or you uh, go buy groceries, this is all part of consumption. The next part is investment, or I, which is business spending on capital. So when businesses build a new factory or open a new store or invest in some other type of capital spending, maybe buying new equipment, then that would be considered investment. G is government spending, and government spending is made up of public services. It could be spending on the military, spending on education, healthcare, um, spending on new roads, airports, seaports, and so on. And then net exports. And net exports is simply exports minus imports. So whatever the United States is exporting, and then we subtract whatever we're importing. All right, and let me just write down how the formula looks before we go a little bit further. So here we have GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And I'm going to put NX for net exports. Now, what are the limitations of GDP? Well, it doesn't show us income inequality. So, for example, if you have a rich country and you have maybe a certain percentage of the population is extremely wealthy and everybody else is extremely poor, it does not show us that. So that's one thing it doesn't measure. It doesn't measure environmental damage. So if there's pollution in water or air pollution or land pollution, it does not measure that at all. The informal economy. The informal economy is basically the economy that is not reported. So, for example, income that may not be reported. Maybe you decide to sell handyman services and maybe you don't report your income, or at least not all of your income. Now, we're not talking about illegal income such as drugs or any other type of illegal activity, but as far as like if I hire somebody to clean my gutters for $200 and that person doesn't report that income, well, that's not included in GDP. Another part of the informal economy could be being like a housewife or a parent that stays at home taking care of the children. That is not included in GDP, even though it is considered work. If you're a parent and you're staying home, you're taking care of the children, you're not out in the workforce, you are working at home, cleaning and taking care of children, that is not considered income, even though you are doing something and it's not reported. And then another limitation of GDP is overall well-being. Just because you have a great GDP does not necessarily mean that everybody's doing well. So that's another limitation. All right, let's go through some examples here. This information is from the International Monetary Fund, and this is the World Economic Outlook for 2025. And these are the top 7 economies by nominal GDP. And if we look at it, we have here the United States, which is the largest, has the largest GDP, and it is at $30.5 trillion. And the second largest GDP is China, which is at 19.2 trillion. And then we get into the next few countries, which is greatly smaller. We have Germany, we have Japan, India, Japan, United Kingdom, and France. Now, also another thing about GDP is that this does not include national debt. So even though you may have a large GDP, you may have an enormous debt that you're having to finance, and that is not included in GDP. So, for example, the United States has almost or approximately about a 100% debt, national debt. And so that means that's money that we will be owing in both now and into the future. China has a much larger debt, maybe closer to 300%. So again, uh, just because you have a large GDP is not a guarantee that everything is perfect. Now let's go to the next slide. And this is GDP per capita. And GDP per capita is simply the GDP divided by the population. Okay. And that, let's see, let me just write this here, population. That's just simply a measurement. It's not necessarily um, a good or bad thing, but it just gives you a comparison. So for example, here in the United States, the GDP per capita is about a little over $88,000 per person. Now that is not the same as saying that of average household salary or average salary for an individual. This is just saying if we take the entire nation's GDP and we divide it by each person in the population, then it would be about $88,000 per person. Um, and for example, the United States has a population of about 340 million, roughly. I don't know what the latest statistic is, but it's roughly about 340 million. And we have the GDP of about 30 or so trillion. And so if you divide that, you get about 88,000. But if you look at China, China was in the previous graph, China had a GDP of about 19.2 trillion. But China, the difference is that China has a huge population. So you have about 1.5 billion people in China. And so its GDP per capita is going to be much, much smaller. Even though China has the second largest economy, the GDP per capita is much, much smaller compared to some other countries. And New Zealand is not amongst the top 7 countries in the world, but New Zealand has a much higher GDP per capita than, say, France. So even though France has a larger GDP, France also has a larger population, whereas New Zealand might have a smaller GDP, but it also has a much smaller population, and therefore it has a higher GDP per capita. But again, these are just measurements and comparisons. They don't take into account everything. They don't take into account debt. They don't take into account of pollution, or they don't take into account of an informal economy. But these are just numbers that you might be able to compare one country to another. All right, so in summary, GDP equals a measure of economic activity. We have real versus nominal GDP. Real GDP takes away or is adjusted for inflation, whereas nominal GDP is just the cold numbers. It's calculated via production, income, or expenditures, and it has limitations, but it is widely popular, and it is a useful tool. All right, thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and stay tuned for more videos later on. Thanks.